It's said that the Chavetz Chaim was fond of telling a story, which we're going to need to understand, about his experience learning Bechavrusa with RavChaimEisensteinOnChanuka5770478 on one of the afternoons of Chanukah. They were learning, they were steiging together, and at the end of the Chavrusa, actually a little bit earlier than the Chavetz Chaim had expected, Rav Nachumka took the Gemara and he closed it and he just sat there. Rav Nachumka sat, didn't do anything, and he sat for about an hour and a half. The Chavetz Chaim, as a Talmud, was quiet, and his Rebbe was just sitting there. An hour and a half later, Rav Nachumka got up and said, "Come Yisrael Meir, let's light the menorah." What happened in that hour and a half? Before we internalize what happened in that hour and a half, let's ask some basic questions about the essence of Neros Chanukah. The Gemara describes in Shabbos, Tan Rabbana Mitzvahs Chanukah, Nerish Ubeisa, V'amahadrin, V'amahadrin, Min Amahadrin. Immediately the Gemara jumps into the notion of Hiddur. Why the centrality of Hiddur? Question number one. Question number two, Hiddur mitzvah, when it comes to Chanukah, is out of whack. Normally we say that the halacha is that a person is only supposed to spend 1/3 of the primary value of the mitzvah. So if a normal esrog costs $30, according to halacha, you're only supposed to spend $40 on an esrog for its Hiddur. Anything more than that, you should ask a posek whether you're even supposed to spend more than $40 for an esrog. However, when it comes to Neros Chanukah, one candle, let's say, costs 10 cents. If there are 10 people in the house on the 8th night, 80 candles, 80 times 10 cents. That doesn't make any sense. Why is that? Why is it when it comes to Neros Chanukah, Hiddur is so central? The Beis HaLevi and the Chidush Erim explain the centrality of Hiddur revolves around the fact that the whole miracle only happened because of Hiddur. Chashmonaim could have relied on the rule, Tuma Hutra B'tzibur, that the halacha mandates that if all the oils are tamei, they're defiled, you could use just defiled oil. Yet, the Hasmoneans felt that there was a need, particularly on Chanukah, during the struggle with the Greeks, with the Yevanim, to make sure that the mitzvah was done bihidura, in its beauty. The Beis HaLevi and the Chidush Erim don't answer or don't explain is why is it that Hiddur was so important to the Chashmonaim at this time. So now we understand why Hiddur mitzvah is part and parcel to Chanukah, in the sense that the Chashmonaim felt it was so necessary. So the Beis HaLevi and the Chidush Erim have explained to us both the halacha and the machshava, but what they haven't explained to us is what was going on in the minds of the Chashmonaim. Why did they feel that now we can't compromise on Hiddur? As one of the women that I used to learn and study with in a group on the Upper West Side said, after she heard this idea, she described it as, if we compromise, sometimes the miracles won't happen. But why over here, when it came to Hiddur mitzvah, did the Chashmonaim say, we can't compromise Hiddur? What happened during the time of the Chashmonaim that allowed the Yevanim to go into the Mikdash? So from a political perspective, Malchus Yisrael had become weak, and the Greeks entered. For the Bach, in his commentary in Shulchan Aruch on the end of Hilchos Chanukah, there's a spiritual dimension as well. Says the Bach, what happened was, we had become nisrashel. We had become lazy in the avodah of the Mikdash. Historically, we know not only had the Kohanim and Bnei Yisrael become lax in their avodah, but there was also something else that had taken place. The Greeks introduced a perspective of the world that didn't always contradict halacha. But it elevated the chomrios, it elevated the material part of the world to a value that we, both The Gentile world, and even, I may say, the Jewish world, today recognizes Greek art has a fantastic value. There's something beautiful in what Greek literature produced for the world. However, not only was there something beautiful, there was something also very dangerous. Because the Hellenists, the Jewish Hellenists, began to look at their existence from a dual perspective. They lived dual lives. They kept halacha, but at the same time, they valued the beauty of this world no longer through the perspective of Torah. It was no longer yaf yefusa shel yefes, the beauty of the aesthetic world ba'al Shem, but rather there was a split. That split was reflected in the passion and in the kedusha of the Chashmonaim. The split where beauty was now something that was outside of the domain of Torah, that split now became a tremendous tension between halacha and the quote-unquote real world. A split that never existed and doesn't have to exist. There is a notion of yaf yefusa shel yefes ba'al Shem, taking in aesthetic and value and looking at it from the perspective of Torah. Once the split takes place, once one looks at beauty of life outside of one's responsibilities in halacha, then two things happen. The first thing that happens is we become lazy and passive in avodas Hashem. And the second thing that happens is kedusha begins to wear away. Sometimes I speak to some of my special talmidim in Yeshivas Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan, yeshiva that I was zocheh to learn in as well as in Tarvadas. And they struggle with some of these ideas. They begin to struggle with the aesthetic of the outside world, the values of the secular world, and its relationship to Torah. To the point that some even introduce quote-unquote halachic solutions to problems that only are problems if people perceive life without Kedusha. The moment that Kedusha would be central to their avodas Hashem, then there would be no problem. The avoda of Chanukah is the avoda of being able to take the hidur, the beauty of all of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's world, and putting it into avodas Hashem. Having that part of one's Taryag mitzvos, that one's house, if one is zocheh to be married, that one's house should be filled with Kedusha. Every single part of our lives is seen from the perspective of Taryag mitzvos. Mitzvos are not chiyuvim of halacha. Taryag mitzvos, in the Siva Shalom writes, is Taryag etin, 613 eitzos of iskarvus with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. All of the mitzvos are not about do's and don'ts, but they're about bringing ourselves closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that's what the Chashmonaim were fighting. Halacha without Kedusha. Hisrashlus, yet at the same time being observant. And the message for Chanukah is to be able to take the hidur, every single part of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's beautiful world, every single molecule, and being able to use that in our Ramach Eivarim, in our Shesagidim, in Avodas Hashem. Let's go back to the Chafetz Chaim. After an hour and a half from Nachumka of Aradna gets up and he says, Yisrael Meir, let's light. After they light, Chafetz Chaim asks his Rebbe, what took so long? Why did you wait for an hour and a half? Nachumka said, Yisrael Meir, you didn't notice? Yisrael Meir in his Kedusha, Chafetz Chaim in his Kedusha did not notice that an hour and a half later, Nachumka's wife slowly crept into the house. She was out, and Nachumka wasn't going to light until his wife came home. even though it was a shayla of Ad Shetichla Regel Min Hashuk. L'chatchila, that wasn't the time to light. Nachumka said to Yisrael Meir, we know that the halacha is that Nero Shabbos are docha Neros Chanukah. If a person only has enough money for Nero Shabbos, so then Nero Shabbos comes first. Why? Because Nero Shabbos represents Shalom Bayis. Shalom Bayis is Ma'akev Neros Chanukah. How could that be? Isn't Hidur Mitzvah so central? Isn't Mahadrim Min HaMahadrim one of the basic Yisodos in Avodas Hashem? The answer is that when it comes to Kedusha, Kedusha sometimes tells us that no. The ultimate Kedusha is the bias. As the Pasuk in Divrei Yomim describes, Tocho Ratzu V'Afa. The floor of the Mikdash was laden with love. That means that if there is no Kedusha in the bias that comes from love, pure, intimate love, practical love, if it doesn't come from that mundane Bechina, which really all of it is Avodas Hashem, so then ultimately then we're missing the message of Chanukah. And Neiros Shabbos comes before Neiros Chanukah, said Rav Nachumka5770478. That means that one has to make sure that before one lights, I know, said Rav Nachumka, that my wife feels that she gets some uplifting from seeing my Neiros Chanukah, even though halacha doesn't mandate that she have to be home. However, if her happiness is dependent on that, then I'm going to hold back, and this is my hidur. This is the way that I'm going to be mekayim the hidur mitzvah. In fact, Rav Nevin Sal told me that he has an interesting shaila. What happens if one only has enough money for Neiros that evening at home to light up the home versus Neiros Chanukah? He said he doesn't think it's a special halacha Neiros Shabbos. Presumably it's a halacha in Shalom Bayis itself. And therefore not only on Shabbos would this halacha apply, this halacha would apply throughout the week. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu should give us the siyata d'shmaya, that this Chanukah should be one in which we internalize this essential message of Kedusha, which has two anafim, two components to it. Number one, the Kedusha of being able to take all facets of our being, all facets of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's beautiful world, and bringing it to the Mabat of Torah through the Taryag Eitzos of Iskarvus HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And number two, that the first step for those of us who are Zochet to begin to build homes, for those of us who are now seeing our homes grow, to be able to see every single part of Avodas Hashem, not only in our Torah, Avodah Gemilas Chasadim, but even in the most basic parts of our home, even in the Ritzifa, even on the floors of our home, that should be filled with Ava, that should be filled with Kedusha, and to realize that sometimes that comes even before Neiros Chanukah.